Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction. Okay. So my name is Ellen Murphy and I actually finished my PhD pretty much this time last year, so it's been a while since I've presented on it, so bear with me. But yeah, my PhD looked at retention strategies for clinical trials, exploring the cost planning and communication processes. Oh, um, so slides have gone a bit funny, but that's okay. But as we all know, participant retention is an ongoing challenge for trial teams. If trials lose significant numbers of participants, the trial becomes underpowered, which means the trial's ability to answer the research question is jeopardised. The trial results can be less valid and reliable. Poor retention rates can also increase the length of running the trial and the costs involved, and also raise ethical concerns. So all in all, poor participant retention rates can really contribute to research waste. Now, thankfully, trial teams often use retention strategies, and retention strategies are activities aimed at encouraging continued participation in the trial to really prevent missing data and to kind of encourage data completeness. So such activities include monetary incentives, prompts and reminders for data collection, newsletters, being flexible and offering multiple methods of data collection. However, there's lots of gaps within the literature when it comes to retention strategies. We know very little about the planning process involved, when during a trial are they planned, what factors are taken into consideration, how they're reported and communicated within the trial. So really this is where my PhD comes in, and we wanted to address some of these gaps within the literature. Okay, so I think all my slides are going to be looking a bit funny, but that's all right. So the first piece of work that we conducted was what I loosely call a costing piece. So basically with this piece of work, what we aimed to do was to estimate the cost of retention strategies and then compare these costs to the evidence of effectiveness. So from existing literature, we were able to identify the top 10 most routinely used retention strategies within the UK. We then made assumptions as to how each of these is most likely to be implemented and the costs involved in doing so. And we applied these assumptions then to a various number of different trials to generate estimated costs. So once we had our estimated costs, we then compared these costs to the evidence of effectiveness for each strategy. And ultimately, what we found is that retention strategies can be very, very expensive. However, there's very little high quality evidence to show they're effective. So currently, as it stands, trial teams are investing limited trial resources into strategies that may or may not actually work at improving retention rates. So really the key takeaway from this piece is that trial teams really need to start formally evaluating the effectiveness of retention strategies so we can gather high quality evidence to make decisive decisions and know exactly what strategies work and what strategies don't work when it comes to participant retention. So then the second piece of work we conducted was a scoping review. So with this piece, we were interested in seeing, when do trial teams plan retention strategies? Are they proactive in their approaches, and are they considering retention strategies during the initial design and planning stages of a trial? So we reviewed trial protocols because we felt these documents would be a very good proxy as to whether or not this proactive planning is happening. Additionally, SPIRIT guidelines, which are protocol content guidelines, recommend the inclusion of retention strategies and protocols. Whether they're followed or not was to be seen, so we set out to do this. So we conducted a scoping search across different databases over a 5-year period. We included protocols for RCTs in any clinical area, intervention type, population, etc. And we took then a random 10% sample for inclusion within the scoping review. So out of then 722 protocols for phase 2 trials and onwards, only 37% of protocols reported retention strategies, which is quite low. And ultimately what we found is that reporting of retention strategies and protocols is quite poor. And to us, this indicated one of two possibilities. Either trial teams are not proactive in their approaches when considering retention and retention strategies, or they are proactive, but despite the guidance, they're just not reporting strategies within protocols. So then from this point, we were interested to see, okay, during the consent process, is there information provided to potential trial participants about retention strategies? So we reviewed information leaflets for 92 trials in adults. And what we found is that, yes, actually retention strategies are very commonly outlined in pills, particularly monetary incentives due to obviously ethical requirements to do so, but also lots of other information around strategies like reminders, newsletters, if their parking and transport to clinic visits are covered, etc. But what we didn't see is that the importance of retention and the value of remaining in the trial were not really outlined in pills very commonly. It wasn't something that we saw. The consequences of missing data was also something that wasn't commonly explained in a pill. So even though retention strategies are outlined, the actual importance of retention itself are very rarely communicated within a pill. So then the final piece of work really to kind of tie everything together and get a more in-depth understanding of the various processes around planning and communication were interviews with members of trial teams. So I interviewed 24 members of trial teams from across Ireland and the UK. So this included trial managers, research nurses, study coordinators, PIs, etc. And what the interviews really highlighted for us is that actually trial teams tend to be very proactive in their approaches. They're considering retention and retention strategies from the trial outset, but they're also very dynamic also in their response. If additional issues with retention rates are seen as the trial is ongoing, they're responsive to this at that time point and additional strategies are planned and implemented. Now, the choice of strategy was quite interesting, and that was mainly influenced by experience of having used the strategy previously, which really isn't surprising considering there's not a lot of evidence out there regarding retention strategies. So, for example, if a trial team has used a newsletter previously and they themselves feel the newsletter was successful, it's the main indicator of that they'll use that strategy again. And then lots of different strategies were seen, so they used lots of different formal strategies, but also the interviews highlighted that informal elements such as building rapport with participants, really taking the time to really clearly set expectations about what the trial involves at the point of consent were seen to be really important for facilitating good retention rates throughout the trial. And then the interviews also provided us insights into previous findings. So we saw from the review that protocols don't often include retention strategies, and the interviewees highlighted that this is likely because they might be outlined in a standard operating procedure or other internal documents. But despite the guidance, they just don't end up in protocols. And then regarding the importance of retention, the interviewees felt that this is something that is more so verbally explained at the point of consent, or it's written physically in follow-up communications from the trial team, rather than having extremely long, which are already very long, information leaflets. So that was a super quick whistle-stop tour of the PhD, and what we kind of found overall is that planning and implementing retention strategies is actually much better in practice than is being reported within trial documents. But ultimately, we also need good reporting for transparency in trial conduct. So hopefully, if there's larger emphasis placed on the importance of retention from trial outset, mandatory reporting requirements, it will really kind of ensure that trial teams are considering retention from trial outset, how they can maximize retention rates by the design of the trial, implementing retention strategies, gives trial teams more time to consider the resources that they're going to need for strategies, if there's any evidence out there, if they can plan a formal evaluation, etc. So, as I said, we saw lots of different retention strategies being used across the various different pieces of the PhD work. But ultimately, as I've said before, formal evaluations are really needed. So through, for example, studies within trials, and there's lots of guidance out there from Trial Forge and the PRESS project, to really ensure that we are gathering high quality evidence to know what strategies work and what strategies don't work. So really, that's kind of it for me. It's, like I said, a very brief overview of the PhD. So happy to answer any questions after during the panel discussions. So thank you very much.